Related to Peek Through Time, Jackson Prison was a city within a city. By Minetta Har, Jackson Citizen Patriot. Citizen Patriot File Photo. Michigan's first state prison sat along Mechanic Street from 1838 to 1934. By 1882, it was the largest walled prison in the world. Once upon a time, there was a small city just north of downtown Jackson. Railroad cars stopped there, the streets were made of brick, houses dotted the perimeter, and a hospital and shops made everything from furniture to pottery. The city on Mechanic Street closed in 1934, as most of the population was relocated even farther north of town to 4000 Cooper Street. Older residents and visitors to Jackson know this isn't make-believe. They and the relatives of family members who worked at the Jackson prison and have heard the stories know it to be a real place, and occasionally a brutal one. For instance, John Morris, the warden from 1870 to 1875, was prosecuted for his brutality to prisoners. The assistant warden, 33 inmates, firefighters, doctors, and seemingly anyone else involved in prison life testified at his trial. Morris had a wonderful demeanor to the outside world, but inside the prison, he became a monster. Morris once had a prisoner whipped 63 times. Another, who had suffered an injury to an arm during the Civil War, was tied against a wall with wet leather bands at the wrists and ankles. By the time the bands had dried and the man was untied, his arm was so severely injured it had to be amputated. There was also night keeper John H. Purvis, whose published journal brings to life the incorrigible inmates, as well as those who simply were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Purvis also tells stories of Chaplain Albert M. Ewart, who taught prisoners painting, poetry, and other kinds of writing in what he called a progressive club. He also caused great controversy when he took 24 inmates dressed in suits and ties to his home for a Thanksgiving dinner. That's nothing compared to Harry Jackson, the last warden at the old prison and first one at the new facility, who took a group of inmates to a brothel on Pearl Street before they were moved to their new home. These and many other stories are what bring the old prison to life when Judy Gale Crosno leads tours through the building. She spent months researching in Jackson and Lansing and continues to learn more through books or letters, as well as photographs passed along by friends and family of former guards or employees. Jo Ellis Smith, the daughter of the prison farm manager from 1917 to 1947, has given Crosno photos of the facility, as well as first-hand knowledge because she grew up in a house on its perimeter. Another woman told Crosno about her 7-foot-tall grandfather, who worked as a guard and was part of the 1912 riot. His thumb was bitten off by a prisoner with syphilis. He contracted the disease and died from it. Ewart was the last chaplain at the old prison, and his granddaughter, Catherine Ewart Benson, donated his papers to the Lansing Historical Society. Ewart asked inmates to write about specific topics, what they could do to better their lives while a prisoner, what they felt about the crimes they committed, and what would it take for them to be productive citizens again. Ewart's wife would regularly bake cookies for him to pass out to inmates, and his son would drive a handful of prisoners into Jackson to play in various weekend bands. Back then, inmates also worked outside on prison farms, did domestic work in the terrace houses lining the outside of the prison walls, and played baseball against the town team, with spectators sitting on blankets and having picnics on the prison grounds. The prison opened in 1838 and was closed in 1934 because there were 3,840 prisoners, too many for the facility to handle despite the many additional cell blocks that were added through the years. By 1882, it was the largest walled prison in the world and a quarter the size of Jackson in terms of population. It started with 3 log cabins, built with huge, wide logs, almost like a fur trader's post. Just 2 years after it opened, on a foggy night June 1, 1840, 10 of the 85 inmates dug their way out of the cabins and escaped. The fugitives terrorized the community, robbing banks and becoming known as the Jackson Robber Gang. It took 2 years to finally capture 8 of them in what was called the Oak Forest, now known as Spring Arbor Road. 1 man had been shot in the leg. The other 2 were never found. The main prison, now the gallery of Armory Arts Village, had 4 stories with 300 cells. There was no heat, electricity or plumbing. Men had a honey bucket in their cell that was emptied once every 24 hours. They bathed twice a month and had their laundry washed twice a month. At first they wore black and white striped uniforms, but those proved too costly, so men wore clothing and shoes donated by the community. Prisoners weren't ever allowed to talk to one another, and gradually they whistled as a means of communication. When the prison brass caught on, that, too, was outlawed. The administration building was designed by Elijah E. Myers, the same Illinois architect picked in 1872 to design the Michigan Capitol, actually the third Capitol building in Michigan history. Through the years, factories were added to the prison grounds, and all the men worked in one of them or were marched into town to work at a factory. Prisoners at the Jackson Carriage Company earned 33.5 cents a day, 28 cents going to the government. After it closed, the old prison was later used by the National Guard. Today the building is filled with creativity, as mainly artists rent apartments in the spacious facility or have studios there. Prison tidbits. Jackson was chosen to house Michigan's first state prison in 1837. A year later, 3 log cabins were built to house prisoners. Prisoners provided cheap labor that brought industry to towns, so prisons were coveted. Capital punishment was abolished in Michigan in 1846, but those prisoners who were sentenced to die were told they had to spend the rest of their lives in unlit solitary cells in the basements of 3 buildings. In 1902, this confinement ended, and the term lifer was used to describe inmates serving life sentences. The old prison's West Wing, West End Wing and complete West Building were added in 1861 during the Civil War and almost immediately overcrowded. In 1882, the Administration Building, East Wing and East End Wing with a stone wall with guard towers were completed, making Michigan's first state prison the largest walled prison in the world. An intricate labyrinth of tunnels connected prison buildings. Guards used them to reach their watchtowers. Sometimes, prisoners were taken through the tunnels to the yellow cottages that lined the outside of the huge wall around the prison. People who worked at the prison lived in the cottages, and inmates cleaned, ironed, laundered and did other household chores there. A huge riot broke out in 1912 over prisoners who were forced to follow a code of silence and not talk in the prison. It lasted 6 days. Townsfolk brought baskets of food, chairs and tents, and camped out around the prison wall to hear what was happening. The National Guard was finally called in to put a stop to the riot, and the 90 inmates leading it were all beaten. In 1924, the pea soup riot took place because the inmates couldn't tolerate the inedible peas and beans served for lunch and dinner. Albert M. Ewart was hired as a chaplain in the early 1930s, and he reached souls in many ways, religion as well as through the arts. The inmates broadcast a Sunday morning radio program, and a prison jazz and barbershop quartet became so popular they both were hired on weekends to perform at weddings and parties and in restaurants and nightclubs. In 1928, construction of the new facility at 4000 Cooper Street began. The last of the inmates were moved to the new facility in 1935. The old prison was empty until it was used as an armory during World War II, Vietnam and the Gulf War eras. A old map of Wayne County #Michigan, 1860. 1889, last stagecoach holdup in Michigan. #Michigan Did you know? These 5 creepy asylums in Michigan from the state's past are quite disturbing. By Serena Maria Daniels. 2. Eloise Asylum, Westland. Explore the tunnels underneath this asylum. Also known as the Wayne County Infirmary, Psychiatric, and General Hospital Complex, this once sprawling asylum served the invalid and mentally ill for more than 150 years. Abandoned in the 70s, the facility remained a spooky oddity for thrill-seeking teens, where it was said that discarded medical waste and even human bodies remained. The place has since been razed and turned into a golf course. Check out a paranormal investigation of the #Eloise Asylum via #The Potter's House, #The Potter's Field, #Train Tunnels, #House of Digs, #Butler Cemetery, William Ganong Cemetery, Henry Ruff RD, Westland, Michigan, Wayne County, Chicago Road, Michigan Avenue. Among the most significant plants introduced by the indigenous people to the colonists of North America was tobacco. The wealth Spain acquired from their colonies and the enslavement and sale of indigenous people encouraged England to establish their own presence in the New World. The first two colonies, Popham and Roanoke Colony, failed, but the third, Jamestown, founded in Virginia in 1607 CE, succeeded. The Plymouth Colony followed, founded in 1620 CE in Massachusetts and, afterwards, the basic regions of European control in the Americas, in spite or periodic conflicts, were established until the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763 CE, via the Great Lakes region, which resulted in significant reformation and English control of the entire eastern seaboard of the modern-day United States. Via Michigan #Canada. The colonization is recognized as initiating the Columbian Exchange, a modern-day term coined in 1972 CE by the historian Alfred W. Crosby of the University of Texas at Austin, referring to the cross-cultural transmission of animals, crops, disease, technology, cultural values, and human populations between the Americas, West Africa, and Europe. Among the most significant plants introduced by the indigenous people to the colonists of North America was tobacco, which, because it was labor-intensive and required considerable arable land to cultivate, resulted in hostilities between the Europeans and natives as more and more land was taken, deforestation as land was cleared, and the institutionalization of slavery by circa 1640 CE, already established by the Spanish in Central and South America earlier as part of the feudal encomienda system of forced labor. The history of the conquest and colonization of the Americas was later written by the victors, which cast their efforts in a noble light in the interests of exploration, civilization, and conversion of the indigenous people to Christianity. In the modern era, this narrative has been challenged and initiatives proposed to recognize the cultural losses and human rights abuses of the Native Americans and West Africans by the European colonizers, but, so far, nothing significant has come of these efforts.